The year was 2020, and there was one question on everyone's mind. How did Howland Reed manage to kill Arthur Dane at the Tower of Joy? So, I'd been thinking about recording this one for a while, and adding some additional stuff that I just didn't throw in the first time, and so this is going to be the expanded re-record. And as you can probably tell, I have a slightly better mic now, so hopefully the general sound will come across better as well. The obvious elephant in the room is that one of the most prolific theories in the fandom is that Arthur Dane is in fact not dead, but in reality, Mance Rayder. Or maybe Corrin Halfhand. However, if we put the pipe down and the rock aside for the moment, we will naturally return to reality. And in reality, in the story that we're given, this guy killed Arthur Dane. And so, the obvious question becomes, how? How did he do that? Because as the books are careful to point out, Arthur Dane was one bad motherfucker. In fact, when Jaime, who himself is no slouch with the blade, is speaking to Sir Loras, again, no slouch with the blade, he explicitly has this to say about Arthur Dane. I learned from Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, who could have slain all 5 of you with his left hand while he was taking a piss with the right. And while this might easily be written off as Jaime embellishing someone's skills with the fond memories of youth, this opinion about Arthur Dane is generally considered to be true by everyone we encounter in Westeros, including the random maids at Winterfell that Catelyn overhears. They whispered of Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, deadliest of the 7 knights of Aerys' Kingsguard. And it's incidentally shared by Ned Stark himself. The finest knight I ever saw was Sir Arthur Dane, who fought with a blade called Dawn, forged from the heart of a fallen star. They called him the Sword of the Morning, and he would have killed me, but for Howland Reed. And so, we're again back at our original question. What the fuck did Howland Reed do to save Ned's life? And how on earth did he kill this guy? So to answer this question, I think it's important for us to understand the tactics and arsenal of the Crannogmen. The books introduce us to the 3 staple weapons of the Crannogmen's arsenal. Number 1, the bow, which is used to fire poison arrows from a great distance and generally a concealed position. Number 2, the frog spear, which spears frogs. And lastly, the net, which is used to entrap, entangle, and immobilize enemies so they can be easily dealt with by the generally physically smaller Crannogmen. After all, as the books make pretty clear, Crannogmen typically suffer in the conventional hand-to-hand combat department, as Howland Reed is stomped on by a gang of 3 squires. And thus, I would argue that it stands to reason that Howland Reed must have used at least one of these weapons to defeat Arthur Dane. Now, as you've probably noticed, the arsenal of Crannogmen weapons seems to stick to a particular doctrine, and that doctrine is distance. These are weapons that are all effective over distance, and ones that preclude the need from directly grappling or engaging in hand-to-hand fighting with the opponent. The bow can be shot from far away, and again likely a concealed position. The frog spear has an element of reach to it. It's a spear, which inherently puts distance between you and the enemy. And the net, whether you choose to throw it and let go of it over the enemy, or whether you choose to hang onto it and throw it, is more or less a hand-projected weapon designed to cover distance and incapacitate the opponent. And in general, Crannogmen tactics are going to favor distance, concealment, ambush, and some sort of way of putting your opponent off footing, be it by forcing them to engage you in a marsh, or by throwing a net over them. Now there is out there an already existing theory that Howland Reed killed Arthur Dane with some kind of poison, and this would be supported by the text, as we do see the Crannogmen poison their arrows and kill Ironborn raiders while Victarion is occupying Moat Cailin. However, there is a bit of a problem with this theory, as we know the Kingsguard Knights have very high quality armor. It is a scaled chest rig with plated arms, shoulders, and legs, worn over mail with undergarment. And as we know, the Crannogmen's arrows are not capable of penetrating a layer of mail. When my boy Victarion is occupying Moat Cailin, he ends up having to wear his mail all day to protect himself from these arrows. In Moat Cailin, he had taken to wearing mail day and night. Sore shoulders and an aching back were easier to bear than bloody bowels. So clearly, mail is going to protect you from being poisoned by Crannogmen arrows. And interestingly enough, this problem isn't exclusive to Crannogmen arrows. As it turns out, the frog spear as well has difficulty dealing damage through mail. When Mira, Bran, Jojen, and Hodor encounter Sam, Mira throws a net over him, successfully taking him down, and then she prods him a bunch with the frog spear, to no serious effect. Like, clearly Sam doesn't enjoy being poked, but like, Sam doesn't enjoy a lot of things. He has no punctured organs, he's not bleeding, he's able to walk, he has not pierced a lung or anything. The guy is fine. However, that aside, there's an entirely different layer of problem with the poisoning scenario in general, and that's that no poison that we see deployed in the neck is capable of killing a man within a few minutes, certainly not during the critical seconds of a sword fight. The victims of Cranagman poisoning die, surely, but they die much more slowly and in a rather horrific way. And once again, we can turn towards Victisi for some enlightenment on this situation.
The poison arrows of the bog devils need only scratch a man, and a few hours later he would be squirting and screaming as his life ran down his legs in gouts of red and brown.
So obviously terrifying, but also obviously a multi-hour long process. In reality, I believe the only fast-acting poison we've seen thus far is the Strangler, and there's no real reason to suspect that Howland Reed would have either been in the possession of the Strangler or had the means to acquire access to the Strangler. And at no point is it noted that Arthur Dane died clutching at his throat and gasping for a last breath. So at this point you can probably see where I'm going with this. If the arrows and the frog spear were insufficient to penetrate the armor of the opponent, then the only weapon left in the arsenal would be the net. And yes, you would be correct, I do think this is supported by the text. But I hear you. You're saying, hold up, random internet guy, you're completely off your rocker, you've fallen off the cliff on this one. We have no reason to believe the net is this important in the story. I mean, I can't even remember the net being there. Can you even prove anyone has a net? And certainly, if there was even a net, which I'm not admitting to there being one, it would definitely never be in the presence of Bran, who the whole story about Arthur Dane being a great knight, being told by Ned, was in the presence of also, and there'd be no reason to think that it would all be relevant because Bran might have a vision about the Tower of Joy. And again, quite honestly, I'm beginning to become unconvinced of the idea that nets even exist. And I hear you. I get what you're saying, imaginary straw man skeptic that's a caricature of the comments I get here online. I have put forward a bold proposition, and such propositions surely require backing. And so, let us examine the net's place in our story. The word net, standalone and referring to a net like the one that Mira uses, appears a grand total of 0 times in Game of Thrones. It appears for the first time on page 206 of the PDF of A Clash of Kings in a Bran chapter. I don't know which one, you have to look it up yourself. And it is described like this when Mira very first appears in the hall in front of Bran. As the newcomers walked the length of the hall, Bran saw that one was indeed a girl, though he would never have known it by her dress. She wore lambskin breeches, soft with long use, and a sleeveless jerkin armored in bronze scales. Though near Rob's age, she was slim as a boy, with long brown hair knotted behind her head, and only the barest suggestion of breasts. A woven net hung from her one slim hip, a long bronze knife from the other. Under her arm, she carried an old iron great helm, spotted with rust, and a frog spear and round leathern shield were strapped to her back. So, as we can see, the net appears front and center. It is the first piece of the arsenal to be put forward, and while Mira is notably carrying a bronze knife, I don't think this is as good of a candidate. But I hear you. How can we be certain that this knife isn't a Chekhov's knife and the showrunners got that shit 100% right because Dave and Dan are such brilliant genius boys? Well, let's dive ahead and see where else the net presents itself, and if the knife presents itself there too. So the next mention of the word net in regards to a net, and incidentally the next mention of the word net when you use Control F in A Clash of Kings, is of course again in a Bran chapter, which begins, Mira moved in a wary circle, her net dragging loose in her left hand, the slender three-pronged frog spear poised in her right. Summer followed her with his golden eyes, turning, his tail held stiff and tall, watching. Yai! The girl shouted, the spear darting out. The wolf slid to the left and leapt before she could draw the spear back. Mira cast her net, the tangles unfolding in the air before her. Summer's leap carried him into it. He dragged it with him as he slammed into her chest and knocked her over backwards. The damp grass cushioned her fall, but beneath went out of her an oof. The wolf crouched atop her. So again, the net is front and center, and even though Mira goes down, Summer is entrapped in the net, and notably this net was used against an opponent that was focusing directly on her, as opposed to attacking from concealment, or attacking an opponent from an angle they're not expecting. So while this might not be the best performance of the net, this is solidly building in a certain direction. And so let's look ahead and see if we continue building in that direction. At the very end of page 271 of the PDF of A Clash of Kings, the net again enters our story. "I never knew anyone who fought with a net before," he told Mira, while she scratched the direwolf between the ears. "Did your master at arms teach you net fighting?" "My father taught me. We have no knights at Greywater, no masters at arms, and no maester." "Who keeps your ravens?" She smiled. "Ravens cannot find Greywater Watch. No more than our enemies can." Now, if that's not a 3-point half-court simultaneous slam dunk for this theory, I don't know what is. She's literally telling Bran, the only person who might ever have access to a vision at the Tower of Joy, that her father taught her to net fight. And so all those Valyrian steel shotguns you're always hearing about, yeah, I think we know we can shove them. We got some pretty solid evidence here that this thesis is moving in the correct direction. But again, I'm sure there will still remain some hardcore skepticism, so let's continue on through the series and discern if this net crops up again. On page 272 of the PDF of A Clash of Kings, our net once again appears. At the wall, Bran had always wanted to see the wall. His bastard brother Jon was there now, a man of the Night's Watch. Beyond the wall, Mira hung the net from her belt. Now, this may seem rather innocuous until you realize that the entire context of this conversation is surrounding the Raven dreams and the Three-Eyed Crow and them being pulled to the north, which is connected to, again, Bran's green dreams, and the possibility for him as a character to actually see events in the past, like the Tower of Joy. So while this is a minor mention, I think we should not overlook how it's woven in again with all of the same thematics and elements that would lead us to think this theory might have some credibility. And just shortly after that, on page 275 of the PDF copy of A Clash of Kings, we get this little passage. "No sooner did Mira touch the ground than she snatched up her spear and net again. Jojen never took his eyes off Summer." "We will talk again," he promised Bran. "It was the wolves, it wasn't me." He didn't understand why they'd gotten so wild. So again, rather innocuous mention, it would seem, unless we take into account the fact that the net is immediately what Mira goes to for combat, and that this whole thing is in the context of Bran worrying and spending too much time in Summer's mind, and not understanding the consequences of that, which is all part of his Green Dream journey, which again connects back to the fact that he's really the only character who we might get a TOJ scene out of. Now, those little passages wrap up all of the net mentions in A Clash of Kings, and we have to flip forward to A Storm of Swords to find our next mentions, so let's do that. On page 89 of the PDF copy of A Storm of Swords, we encounter the following passage. "Mira wore a long, sharp dagger, but her favorite way to fight was with a slender 3-pronged frog spear in one hand and a woven net in the other." So, notably, the description of the knife itself has changed, implying, to me at least, that George gives very little fucks about this knife, and that we, the reader, are also supposed to give very little fucks about this knife. It's never described in great detail. First, it's a long bronze knife. Next, it's like a long dagger. I mean, not much going on here with the knife, in my opinion. However, we do see that her favorite way to fight, and again, she was taught this by her father, Howland Reed himself, is with frog spear and net. And we know the frog spear isn't going to be much help against a guy in Kingsguard armor, leaving the net as the only likely option. And just a little bit later on page 92 of the PDF copy of A Storm of Swords, we see the following passage. "The gods give many gifts, Bran. My sister is a hunter. It is given to her to run swiftly, and stand so still she seems to vanish. She has sharp ears, keen eyes, a steady hand, with net and spear. She can breathe mud and fly through trees. I could not do these things, no more than you could." So again, the net is the first mentioned, and it's associated directly with the pantheon of Mira's Crannogman abilities, which she learned from her father, Howland Reed. So again, we're seeing a pretty solid consistency of pattern here. The net's always featured front and center. It's always in the brand chapters. It's oftentimes at the beginning of a brand chapter or during a very important conversation in regards to Bran's powers. And again, this is all part of the journey to Bloodraven, which is part of Bran maybe being able to see things in the past and become a Green Seer, and that is where is contained within the possibility for any of the readers or anyone in the story to witness what happened at the Tower of Joy. And then we get to one of the very interesting encounters on page 522 of the PDF copy of A Storm of Swords, and it goes something like this. Bran wriggled across the floor, dragging his dead legs behind him until he could reach out and touch Mira's foot. She woke at once. He had never known anybody to wake so quick as Mira Reed, or to be so alert so fast. Bran pressed a finger to his mouth so she'd know not to speak. She heard the sound at once. He could see that on her face. The echoing footfalls, the faint whimpering, the heavy breathing. Mira rose to her feet without a word and reclaimed her weapons. With her three-pronged frog spear in her right hand and the folds of her net dragging from behind her left, she slipped barefoot towards the wall. Jojen dozed on, oblivious, while Hodor muttered and thrashed in restless sleep. Now, this is the scene where they encounter Sam, and obviously they think he's some kind of monster, or in Bran's case, the thing that came in the night. So let's examine what happens a moment later when he runs up against Mira and her net. From the well came a wail, a piercing screech that went through him like a knife. A huge black shape heaved itself up onto the darkness and lurched towards the moonlight. And the fear rose up in Bran so thick that before he could even think of drawing Hodor's sword the way he'd meant to, he found himself back on the floor with Hodor roaring, "Hodor! Hodor! Hodor!" the way he had in the lake tower whenever the lightning flashed. But then the thing that came in the night was screaming too, and thrashing wildly in the folds of Mira's net. Bran saw her spear dart out of the darkness to snap at it, and the thing staggered and fell, struggling with the net. The wailing was coming from the well, even louder now. On the floor, the black thing flopped and fought, screeching, "No! No! Don't! Please don't!" Mira stood over him, the moonlight shining silver off the prongs of her frog spear. "Who are you?" she demanded. "I'm Sam!" The black thing sobbed. "Sam! Sam! I'm Sam! Let me out! You stabbed me!" He rolled through the puddle of moonlight, flailing and flopping in the tangles of Mira's net. Hodor was still shouting, "Hodor! Hodor! Hodor!" It was Jojen who fed the sticks to the fire and blew on them until the flames leapt up crackling. Then there was light, and Bran saw the pale, thin-faced girl by the lip of the wall, all bundled up in furs and skins beneath an enormous black cloak, trying to shush the screaming baby in her arms. The thing on the floor was pushing an arm through the net, trying to reach his knife, but the loops wouldn't let him. He wasn't any monster beast, or even Mad Axe drenched in gore. Only a big fat man, dressed up in black wool, black fur, black leather, and black mail. "He's a black brother," said Bran. "Mira, he's from the Night's Watch." "Hodor?" Hodor squatted down on his haunches to peer at the man in the net. "Hodor," he said again, hooting. "The Night's Watch, yes." The fat man was still breathing like a bellows. "I'm a brother of the Night's Watch." He had one cord under his chins, forcing his head up, and the others digging deep into his cheeks. "I'm a crow! Please let me out of this!" Bran was suddenly uncertain. "Are you a three-eyed crow?" "He can't be the three-eyed crow." "I don't think so." The fat man rolled his eyes, but there were only two of them. "I'm only Sam. Samwell Tarly. Let me out. It's hurting me." He began to struggle again. Mira made a disgusted sound. "Stop flopping around! If you tear my net, I'll throw you back down the well. Just lie still and let me untangle you." And so, Sam's obviously very clumsy, but we can see the effectiveness of the net on somebody dressed in cumbersome clothing. And I think the only question remaining from this scene was to confirm our earlier assumption that the frog spear could not actually penetrate the armor. And as we skip ahead slightly, the answer to that is revealed.
He touched his belly with a black-gloved hand.
Am I bleeding? I can't see. It was just a poke to get you off your feet,
said Mira.
Here, let me have a look.
She went to one knee and felt around his navel.
You're wearing mail! I never got near your skin. Well, it hurt all the same,
Sam complained.
So there we go. It seems like a fait accompli to me. The net's what fucks you up and it's what takes you down. The frog spear might help poke you over, but it's not gonna punch through armor. Certainly not Kingsguard armor. Now, a moment later, the net is mentioned kind of tangentially again, just as something that Mira is carrying along with her spear. And so we're going to move on to the next book in the series and see if we can find any more mentions of nets. Now, in A Feast for Crows, there are no more mentions that I could find of Mira's net, and I don't think Mira even appears in A Feast for Crows. But point being is that when you do a Control F and you look in the book for nets, we do find a net restraining Robb Stark's wolf, Greywind. So while we're not shown something specifically with Mira and Bran, we are shown the restraining power of the net in relationship to a direwolf, so you could maybe make something out of that. Although I would just chalk it up to other general evidence that nets are good at containing strong fighters, or in this case, a strong wolf. Now, interestingly enough, when I did the Control F through Dance of Dragons, I don't see any more mention of the net, so it appears to not be being a factor going on anymore in Bran stories. There was limited mention of nets in Daenerys stories, and fishing nets appear a few times. But since we're not spending a ton of time with Mira particularly anymore, it seems like the net has kind of floated out of the picture for the moment being. Now, I suppose the true skeptic would probably argue that the net would need to be appearing in every single book, and probably even every Bran chapter, for this to be any sort of credible theory. The net is really important in a bunch of times that are super important to Bran, and while it does have a Mira focus, that focus connects it directly back to Howland Reed, which throws us right back around to our original Howland Reed problem. How the fuck did Howland Reed kill Arthur Dayne? Well, he threw a net over him. But how did that all go down in general? Well, I'll give you my best hypothetical version of events. The fighters begin to clash. This is a 3-on-7 battle, so I'm guessing that Oswald Wint and the Bull probably take 2 people, while Arthur Dayne, who's young and known as a great fighter, probably the best fighter of all of them, takes on 3. Being skilled knights, they would know that they need to kill people as quickly as possible and lower the numbers and odds in their favor so as to make it less likely that they're attacked from behind or hamstrung or some kind of shit like that. And so these hard veterans go to work on these less experienced killers. People are dropping, crying out, potentially being wounded with very severe injuries, but being left for dead as the fight moves on. Wint and the Old Bull probably managed to down a guy apiece, but in the end, the numbers tell against them. Gradually, the fighters are whittled down, probably, weakest to toughest. And then, in the end, we're left with, likely, Ned Stark, a probably middling fighter in this equation, likely facing off against Dayne, who has just cut down potentially 1 or 2 other middling fighters. And there it is, the screams of his friends all around him, Ned Stark, backpedaling, doing everything he can to put the bulk of ice between the blinding blur that is Dawn's fury in Arthur Dayne's hands. And suddenly, from behind, from a concealed angle, when Dayne's least expecting it, the moment when his attention is too long locked on his opponent, Howland Reed throws that net. Dayne tries to move, but the more he tries to move, the more wrapped up he gets. He tries to use Dawn to fend off the oncoming Stark and to potentially cut his way out of this net, but it's of no use. And so reluctantly, he lets Dawn drop in one hand, potentially trying to use Dawn and the net itself to shield him from the blows of ice, hoping that maybe Ned might cut him free. But Ned's too smart for that. He picks his moment. He waits for an opening. And as Arthur Dayne pulls out his rondel or dagger to attempt to cut himself free of the net, Howland Reed makes his move. He prods him gently with the frog spear on the off leg, on the hip, somewhere that offsets his balance. Dayne is already pivoting, tilting, trying to fend off attacks from Stark, trying to find this Krennicman, trying to escape this fucking goddamn net. And he falls on the ground. He's trapped. Writhing, Dawn is lost to him. He's desperately using his dagger, trying to slice his way out of this net. And that's when Ned's moment appears. He strikes Arthur Dayne, killing the Great Knight, who dies bleeding out in a net somewhere in the Mountains of Dorne. And if we're being real about this, like if we're being really real, he probably stabbed him in the groin. It would be a vulnerable spot, one where he could be assured there'd be little to no armor, one where he could be assured there'd be little to no chance of survival. So why didn't Ned Stark like talking about his fight with Arthur Dayne? Why didn't he want to relay what actually happened and how Howland Reed actually helped him kill this guy at the Tower of Joy? Well, the answer is pretty obvious if we understand who Ned Stark is. Ned Stark's a man who values honor. Ned Stark's a man who clearly respected Arthur Dayne. And he killed his ass in one of the least respectful, most dishonorable ways possible. He stabbed the greatest living knight in Westeros, hero of childhood stories, and scion to the ancient House Dayne, to death in a net, likely by stabbing him in the balls. That shit doesn't scream honorable. And if there's one thing we know about Ned Stark, he's honorable to a fault. Well, there we go. So that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope these enhanced passages, this updated version, helps to make the theory a little bit more clear and to provide some of the context that I thought would help make this a little bit more sensible, and that I didn't include from the first time I recorded it because I was just trying to make a shorter video, but then the longer I made videos, the more I realized that longer videos are sometimes just as good, and people like to watch them, it seems. So if you enjoyed this video, you can come check me out over on Patreon if you feel like helping me support my cats. There's kind of limited content there, but I'm going to start producing more content going into this new year. There is some special stuff there you can only get there, and like I said, again, I started the page predominantly because I got a lot of cats and they need food and stuff, and so it just generally helps out, and it makes my life easier, which makes it easier for me to make content. So if you want to help out, if you like the stuff here, if you want to get an extra tidbit, go over there, check it out on Patreon. And right now on screen should be the names of everybody from the Patreon right now. There's not a whole lot of us, but there's been some diligent people over the years, and I really want to say thank you to everybody. And of course, feel free to give the video a like, feel free to share it with your friends, and why not your enemies? Share it with everybody all around. So thank you everybody, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time.